What is a contributory mortgage?
Contributory mortgage. That is a mortgage in which multiple investors contribute the funds necessary, and they do so as tenants in common. So let's imagine that 3 or 4 people get together and decide to buy a house together or a commercial property together. They'll be tenants in common according to the amount that they invested. Each one will have shareholdings, if you like, in that property. So when the property's sold, they'll get back on a pro rata basis the proceeds of sale. If it's a profit, on a pro rata basis, they'll share that profit. If they actually lose some of their capital, then the capital available to be returned will be returned on a pro rata basis to what they put in. It's exactly the same with a mortgage investment. If a bunch of investors contribute to a single mortgage investment, then they share the highs and the lows according to the shareholdings that they contributed. That's a contributory mortgage. It would be a way of spreading risk. Banks actually do exactly the same thing. So if there's let's say a big 600 unit apartment going up, banks will, 2 or 3 banks will get together jointly as tenants in common and offer the funding. It means that no one's exposed, but it also means, and this is probably the biggest benefit, is that it goes through the strainer of the due diligence processes of each of those 3 banks. So if you're wanting to put together a consortium of banks, it's much harder, generally speaking, to satisfy everyone's criteria, and you're placed under greater scrutiny because different people have different requirements. I'd say the same applies with contributory mortgages. If you've got savvy investors and there are 3 or 4 of them, then that borrower and the deal is going to undergo greater scrutiny. Well, there's a classic story. There were 2 private investors who I accompanied on a trip down to Wollongong to inspect some units that had to be sold. And there was they'd done second mortgages on these units, 2 blocks of units, and there's about 10 units in each block. And these guys had been doing second mortgages for decades, and they'd never lost a farthing. And they had one rule, and the rule was they never ever loaned unless they inspected the property and spoke to the local real estate agents. Every single time they did that, they told me, well, this has been my experience, they never went wrong. Because when you speak to the local real estate agents, they will put you straight on the value of that property. They know all the nuances of their backyard. It's their job to know, for example, if one side of the street is better selling than the other. It's their job to even know the history of the various properties and what they're likely to go for. A valuer who flies in and values the property and then flies out, he's just going off what he's read on RP data, and it's not nowhere near as reliable a source of information. So we went down. As soon as we inspected the units, as soon as we spoke to the real estate agents, these guys knew they'd done their dough. And I said, how did it happen? And they said, well, we were driving down and we got as far as Campbelltown and we had a flat tyre. And one of the investors loaned his car to his son, and his son had flattened a tyre and left the flat spare in the back of the boot. And they were under a lot of pressure to settle. And they never got to Wollongong, they never got to inspect the properties. And they said, stuff it, we'll just settle. And they settled without inspecting the property. And the one property that they didn't inspect turned out to be a real flea hole, cracks in all the brickwork, and it just wasn't worth what the valuer had said it was worth. He'd used comparables of fantastic units with bigger floor space. Instead of being a 1950s red brick building, it was a 1980s beautiful building, and so he'd massively overvalued the property. Now those valuers had gone bankrupt, and there was no way they were going to be able to sue to get their money back. They had done their dough, and they almost laughed to each other about it because it didn't hurt them that much. They'd made a lot of money over the years and they could afford to take the hit. But it reinforced in their mind and in my mind that if you do not inspect the property, then you can expect to lose your money. Again, it comes down to inspecting the property. There was one house which was loaned against. The valuer came back. He said, "Oh, beautiful house. Looks fantastic." He had photos of the house, and the house had just been built, and the fellow who owned it was a builder, and he'd built the house himself, and he hadn't got any of the tradesman's certificates as he went through. Had a DA, but he hadn't got any of the certificates as he went through. He'd done a shoddy job. Some of the electrical work had been done by someone who wasn't a licensed tradesman, and as a result, when we went on behalf of this investor to sell the property, we were unable to sell it because it didn't have an occupation certificate, and the local council would only give an occupation certificate if various remedial work was done, including taking core samples and jackhammering up a slab. The cost of those works was such that by the time they were all done, the occupation certificate was obtained and the property was sold. They had about a 20% impairment on their capital. And had they gone and inspected the property, they would have seen that it hadn't actually been 100% completed inside. So downstairs there were rendered walls that hadn't been painted, for example. There were clear signs when I inspected the property that it had only just been built, and yet the valuer chose not to mention it. And I suspect to this day that that valuer, getting paid $200 per site, and he has to do 4 or 5 inspections a day, flew past, had a look at the outside, and went off the RP data figures and didn't actually go inside and inspect the property. So almost every trap that you can get into can be solved by inspecting the property.